Thanks for listening to Andy and I ramble a little bit here as everyone joined. So let's jump into this a bit. I am Mike Raine, the editor-in-chief for Canadian Musician magazine, as well as host of the Canadian Musician podcast, as well as our other magazines for NWC, Professional Sound, Canadian Music Trade, Professional Lighting and Production. Joining me today for this month's free webinar, all about grant writing, which has proven to be a very popular topic. But with me is Andy Schichter. Andy is a producer and engineer based in Vancouver, who, by the way, this year was nominated for Recording Engineer of the Year at the Western Canadian Music Awards. He's also co-owner of Park Sound Studio in North Vancouver. But on top of all that, and the primary reason he's joining me today, Andy also works closely with a lot of established and rising artists in their career development through management, tour booking, and especially grant writing. And he's written numerous successful grants for Factor, Creative BC, Music BC, Canada Council of the Arts. He also sits on the board of jurors for Factor, as well as Music BC, the WCMAs, and the Junos. So, Andy, like I said, you're a popular guy, or it's a popular topic. One way or the other, we have a lot of people joining me. So thanks for doing this, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited. I'm glad so many people are interested in this subject.
Absolutely. So we looking to keep this to about an hour. I'm guessing with this many people on this topic, we're going to have a number of audience questions at the end of it. So let's just kind of jump into this. But to start off, Andy, can you just kind of give us a quick introduction in terms of, well, I guess I did it a little bit there, but a little bit of your background when it comes to especially grant writing, the types of grants and the types of artists you've written for and worked with.
Sure. Yeah. So I got into grant writing probably similarly to a lot of other grant writers, and that was just writing for my own project. So I used to play guitar in a band called Echo Nebraska, and was pretty much managing them. So that involved lots of grant writing for touring, recording, and marketing. And when that band ended, I felt like I was still drawn to grant writing. I quite enjoyed it. I found it was a very useful skill to have. So I just, reached out to friends in Vancouver, looking to write grants for them, and just built up my clientele from there. It wasn't until I started actually advertising it on my website that I started to attract clients outside of the Vancouver music scene. But I find it's really helpful for my studio work as well, especially during COVID when budgets were stretched. I was able to work with artists to acquire funding to record at Park Sound here.
Nice. And just before we move on here, one thing I forgot to say off the top, just for everyone watching, in terms of the audience Q&A portion at the end, we're going to be taking questions. The way I'd like everyone to do that is in the chat function here on the meeting. Write in the chat what your question is. It's especially helpful if you started off with just in caps, put question. My colleague Manis is going to be monitoring the chat for questions so that he can send them to me at the end. So I'm not kind of searching through everything, trying to look for all your questions from the previous 45 minutes. So yeah, write question in caps, put out your question there. Manis will pass it on to me and we'll get to those and I'll pass those questions on to Andy at the Q&A portion at the end. But yeah, I guess to kind of lay the foundation for the type of grants we're talking about, especially at the national level, because as we'll get into, there's so many available at the provincial level through the MIAs. But what are the primary national grants that are available to independent musicians in Canada?
Yeah, so there are kind of two main national funders. The first being Factor. So they're probably the one that are the most well known, and they don't just fund artists; they fund like record labels and venues, national service organizers like not-for-profits, anything to do with music. And then there's Canada Council for the Arts, and they fund all sorts of artistic disciplines. So one thing to keep in mind when you're applying for a project through Canada Council is you're not just competing against musicians, you're competing against other people in other artistic disciplines. And the jury isn't just made up of musicians. So when you're writing a grant for them, really dumb down the language, because if you use like acronyms and shorthand, the jury might not know what you're talking about. But in terms of the grants that are available through them, it's pretty much everything you can think of, ones that are specific to touring, marketing, recording, music videos. SOCAN also has a bunch of great grants. They're smaller scale initiatives. I think they mostly pertain to like travel that's unpaid, like showcase events or songwriting sessions. And then there's some other ones through private companies. TELUS has the Story Hive music video grant. RBC has an emerging artist program. There's the Radio Star Maker grant as well. I think that's really just for established artists, though. But yeah, pretty much any music project you think you want to get funded, you can probably find something in Factor or Canada Council.
Yeah. In terms of the SOCAN ones, because I know SOCAN Foundation also has grants. Were those the ones you're referring to, or is it there's SOCAN grants and then SOCAN Foundation grants?
Sorry, those were the ones that I was referring to, the SOCAN Foundation.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Factor, like you said, is kind of like by far the best known funding and grant funding body here in Canada, at least specific to music. It also has, and as you were saying, there's almost a Factor grant to cover anything you're doing and place you are in your career. What's the typical one that most indie artists start with when it comes to
so that'd be the artist development grant. That's kind of the first like entry level grant for artists. So it's for artists who have less than 3 years of recording experience. It's a really simple application to write. It's a $2,000 subsidy, and you can use it for anything you want. So it kind of just helps you, ease the budget a little bit for an entire year. And it's a great application to write for someone who's like interested in writing a grant for the project, and they're a pretty newer act. So I'd recommend that one.
You threw a $1 figure there. In general, kind of what is the scale we're talking about when it comes to grants for independent artists?
So yeah, I mean, it really could be anything, anywhere from a few $100s to like $100,000, depending on the grant that you're writing, as well as where you're at in your career. So a lot of grant funders will have, even though you're applying for the same grant, if you're considered, kind of like an established artist, which will involve a proof of record sales and streaming numbers, you can acquire a higher subsidy. But it really depends on the grant. Some grants like Factor, they have set offers for grants. So there's not really a main budget component when you're applying, because they give the same amount to every artist. Whereas Canada Council, it's very open-ended. If you have, $5,000 of expenses, then that's going to be what you ask for. If you have 30,000 or 60,000, that's what you ask for. So it really depends on the project.
Okay, interesting. As we mentioned, like those that you're talking about there, and we've mentioned so far, are kind of nationwide, Canada-wide grants that everyone has access to. At the provincial level, from province to province, there's a lot of other additional grants that are available through the provincial music industry associations, like your Sask Music, Alberta Music, Music BC, and those sort of things. We can't go through, like we don't have to, it would be almost a webinar for each province to go through all of those separately. So, we're not going to do that. But in terms of, can you just give a general idea of the types of grants that are available at the provincial level through the MIAs and how people can find out about those specific to their own province?
Yeah, so I'll just post a link in the chat here. So this just has a list of all the music industry associations. So they offer grants. Like most funders, usually they'll have a range of grants, anywhere from touring to marketing to music video production. The other nice thing that the MIAs fund is they don't just fund like artist-driven activities; they'll fund initiatives. So if you are passionate about like lifting the voices of underrepresented community in your city, and you want to put on a series of shows or showcases over the course of 6 months, over a year, they'll have opportunities for those. And yeah, I would definitely recommend everyone to check out their MIA and see what kind of grants are available. I don't know how it works in other provinces, but Music BC, there's a membership fee to join, but you don't actually have to be a member to apply for a grant. Those grants are open to members and non-members.
Perfect. Everyone just check in the chat there. If you don't have it open, Andy just posted the link there to the section of SEMA's website where they list those provincial MIAs, music industry associations. So you can go to the one that's for your own province, and on each of the MIA websites, they're going to have a list of grants that they fund specific to artists or their own memberships. We'll also be sharing other links near the end of the webinar that are going to be useful in this regard.
Can I just add something to this
Yeah,
point,
yeah,
actually?
absolutely.
So I forgot to mention that there's a ton of city and provincial art councils as well,
Hmm.
that have, again, similar types of grants to the national funders, and they don't have as high of an applicant list. So
Mm.
if you put together a decent application, you have like an okay shot at getting those, just because they don't get as many applicants, so their success
Oh,
rate's pretty high.
that's a
So
great
I would
tip.
definitely, yeah, I would definitely recommend, wherever you're at, just like Google your city or province and see what kind of art councils they have.
Hmm.
Like I'm sure there are people from Toronto here, and the Toronto Arts Council has incredible grant opportunities. And usually those program coordinators are more than willing to discuss the project with you. So, even if the grant's not due for a few weeks, they're more than willing to have like a half-hour phone conversation about your project, about your initiative, and strategize with you about how to ensure that it's successful.
Yeah,
So yeah, I would check those ones out.
that's awesome. Um, Obviously, you work as a grant writer for hire and collect, someone will hire you to write a factor grant or whatever it is. You collect a percentage as commission if it's successful. But a
Mhm.
lot of artists, it's not like you need a grant writer, correct, to do this. A lot of artists are doing this themselves, or at least starting
Yeah,
out that way.
yeah,
In that case, like at what point should they hire? Like, essentially, at what point is this something that artists can and should do themselves versus when does it become worth it to start hiring grant writers?
yeah. So I mean, like grant writing's not rocket science. Like anyone can do it on their own. Really comes down to the time commitment, and if that's something you want to focus on, or if you're confident in your writing abilities. But I don't know. A good time might to hire a grant writer, like maybe you're going on tour, so you're really focusing on getting the material down tight and booking the shows, doing all the promotion. So you don't necessarily have time to focus on grant writing because you're
Hmm.
about to travel. So that might be a time when someone's looking for a grant writer, um, or just to see what opportunities are out there. Not everyone knows the grants that are available to them, or which might be a smart play to actually apply for a specific project. So I know for me personally, when I work with an artist, you you talk about which grants you might want to go for. That might not be coming up in a couple months, but maybe you make a play in 6 months time when there's a grant opportunity, and that's the one you go for. And you talk about like the marketing process, which activities, which initiatives will yield the best results. So, but I mean, anyone can write a grant on their own. It really just comes down to the time commitment.
Hmm. When it
Yeah.
comes to the fees for that, 'cause I believe when it comes to grant writers who are working with businesses, because there's a lot of factor grants that are for labels and agents and different companies, independent companies within the music industry rather than individual artists. So I believe when you're
Yeah.
doing grant writing for a company, often the arrangement is the grant writer will receive a fee of the grant money that's received if the application is successful. At the individual artist level, what's the norm? Is it a flat fee regardless of success, or is it a percentage of a successful application?
Yeah, so I know for me personally, I do an application fee and then a percentage.
Okay.
I think that's pretty typical, and like the application fee will vary depending on the type of grant and how much work's involved. Um, but so I think that's pretty typical to do an application fee and then a percentage if it's
Okay.
successful. Some people just take a percentage, but it might be a higher percentage as well.
Hmm. So now getting into the nuts and bolts of the application process. And again, each grant application is going to obviously be different. So,
Mhm.
we can't go through every every grants application and discuss exactly what to do. So we're going to talk more in general terms here, but like what information needs to be gathered. If you're going for an individual artist grant, such what at Factor or one of the others, most commonly, what's the information that they need to have gathered and ready to go for their application?
Yeah. So, I mean, every application is slightly different. Like a touring specific grant is going to look very different than a marketing or video grant. But there'll usually be two main components. The first being the budget, which will include your expenses and potentially revenue um, component to the application. And then the rest will be made up of a marketing plan or a questionnaire that's really specific to that grant. But they'll all have things that they'll want you to answer about, the goals of your project. That could be a statistical number, like maybe you want to, accumulate 100,000 streams or play 10 shows that have at least 50-person capacity, a timeline of your activities, the names of everyone you're going to be hiring and paying out for the grant, as well as the purpose. And I find the purpose is the hardest thing to actually write.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, it's really hard to it's really hard not to give the obvious answer, which is, well, the reason I'm doing this, I'm putting together this application is, to further my career and expand my audience. And, I need help paying for this initiative. So you kind of have to be strategic about what your actual purpose is, like what makes this project more important than the next person who's applying. And the other thing that a lot of grants will have is they'll ask for demos or a music component. So all the factor grants have some kind of music component to it. So that's something to consider. It might be a finished project, or it might be a brand new demo that's like just recorded on your iPhone.
Yeah, what is the quality? Because often a factor grants in order to pay to record an album in some instances. So if they're asking for music, what are they asking for? Because it's going to be demos or some form. Like how polished does that have to be?
Yeah, so I guess with the Factor Artist Development Grant, because that's probably the first one you'll apply for, it can be anything. It can be a demo or a finished project. It just can't have been released at the time of recording.
Okay.
So you'd probably understand if you're reading the grant that if they're submitting a phone recording or a low budget recording, they're probably asking for money to record that professionally. If they submit a mastered finished production and they're saying the song's coming out in a few weeks, chances are the application's geared towards asking for marketing money to promote that project. So I definitely recommend to spend some time with the demo. It's fine if you don't have access to recording equipment, but I know for me personally, I listen to the demo first before I read the written portion, just because I want to make sure that just because someone might not know the best course of action for their marketing plan, if it's a good song, I want to hear that recorded. Like I don't want good art to go to waste just because someone doesn't know how they'll market it in 6 months from now. But make sure that it's your instruments are in tune. The vocalist is just giving an incredible performance on it. But it's fine if it's on a phone recording.
As a factor juror yourself, obviously, what instruction are you being given in terms of how to judge applications? Are they telling you how to weight the recording versus how to weight the written components and that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess this is a good tip to consider. So whenever you write a grant, in the program guidelines, there'll be some kind of scoring sheet. And it's the same scoring sheet that the jury members use to review or assess your grant application. So actually, I copied a link here. This one was I'll post it in the chat. This was for Creative BC's career development grant. It's kind of on the forefront of my mind because the grant deadline was a couple of weeks ago. But constantly refer back to the scoring sheet when you're writing a grant. Just think about it like a job application. When you're reworking your cover letter or resume, you're constantly going to pull language from the job application into your cover letter or resume. So continually refer back to the scoring sheet when you're writing, and you can see how everything is weighted too. So you kind of know what to focus on. Where do you concentrate most of your efforts? If you might think something is really important, but it's only worth 5 or 10 points out of 100, don't focus on that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, and I was just going to say that's pretty much it. You use the same scoring sheet, so once you have access to that it's a huge upper hand on other artists who aren't looking at the scoring sheet when writing it.
Are those scoring sheets publicly available usually for all grants?
Yeah, it's all in the program guidelines. So on Factor, it's on their website as well. You can see the scoring sheet. I don't think the Factor ones go into as much detail, like the Creative BC if scoring sheet, whoever's checking it out, it's really detailed and
Yeah.
is posing a lot of questions to you. But yeah, it's all available in the program guidelines.
Mhm. On that note, like when it comes to writing style in the grant applications,
Mhm.
like how much essentially where does that come into it? You know, a lot of artists aren't English majors, know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, how much does writing style play into the success of an application?
One thing I've noticed, I don't think this is the case for Factor, but I know a lot of the MIAs and art councils have this available, is you can submit a video or an audio application if, if English is it, or if you're not, a very effective communicator in like writing, you can submit a video application. So they are pretty um, open to a diverse range of people submitting applications. And if English isn't your first language, a lot of them have um, some kind of a allotment where you're able to work with a grant writer, and because you can't claim grant writing fees as part of a grant budget, but you can if you hire someone to help you communicate your project. So if English isn't your first language, there will be something in the guidelines about how to assist you.
Okay. In terms of, again, kind of especially going back to your experience as a juror,
Mhm.
I'm guessing in that capacity, you've seen obviously a lot of applications completed by other people, whether it's other grant writers or especially independent artists doing it themselves. What are the common critical mistakes that stick out to you that you see people often make in their applications?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is like it's very obvious when a grant is submitted last minute. So definitely spend your time with it. Apply early. Go over, all the grammar. But I find one thing that people don't always do. This is more in the artist development grant. I don't really notice this in the juried sound recording grant through Factor. But uh, people forget to emphasize their past work as part of their pitch. So, like whenever you ask or whenever you propose an activity and you're asking for money for something, show how you've gotten to that point. So, like an example might be if you're wanting to hire a Spotify like playlist publicist, um, talk about what you've done in your past performance history to get you into that position where you feel like that adding that team member is important. So like maybe you've released your first single last year. It's gotten a couple of thousand streams. You've done some MidHub and all those kind of playlist pushing sites. Talk about how that past work was really important to your career. It led you to this point where you're in a position to now hire someone that you want to build upon this like foundation. So I think whenever you're asking for something, like talk about what you've already done on your own to get there.
Hmm. Hmm. I think it's often important. I've often seen, just from my own perspective with Canadian Musician, a lot of stuff we do, that there's almost a misunderstanding about what the grants are. They're
Hmm.
meant to be investments in artists, investments in the music industry in order for them to generate revenue that comes back into the industry. It's meant to be essentially spend money to make money. It's an investment. It's not meant to be charity. And I think
Yeah.
that kind of clouds how a lot of people view the entire application process sometimes.
Yeah. And a lot of like MIAs, like I'll just again speak to the BC Creative BC. It's very important to hire vendors who are BC based. I'm sure all the MIAs are kind of like that as well. I'm sure like Sask Music, um, they want to see that money is going actually back into the Saskatchewan, music or arts sector.
Hmm.
So yeah, yeah, I think with and Factor they have they're national, but there are you can hire vendors outside of Canada, but in terms of like where you actually produce your music, that has to take place in Canada
Hmm.
as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, this money is constantly being reinvested back into our Canadian music scene.
Is there a key difference there between Factor and especially Canada Council for the Arts grants in terms of Factor is very much meant to be an investment in popular music so
Hmm.
that it will be like an economic generator for the industry, whereas Canada Council for the Arts is really meant to help and prop up less commercially popular genres of music.
Yeah. I find that's actually the main difference when you're writing a factor grant versus a Canada Council grant. Factor is like all data, like where you at in your career, what kind of sales goals do you have for this project? Um, so very data centric. Whereas a Canada Council's different. It's a bit more abstract. It's, how is this going to promote Canadian culture? Why is this project, incredibly relevant to these times? So it's not, you don't really have to talk about your past performance history or have like sales goals necessarily. It's more just about the culture and why this project is important. Like why does this mean a lot to you, and why should other people care?
Is there a side of that spectrum between those two things that the provincial MIA administered grants usually fall on?
Probably a little bit more towards the factor end of things, but it's kind of a mix. I haven't written a lot of grants be outside of BC for the MIAs.
Mhm.
I did one for Alberta Foundation of the Arts, and it was a bit of a mix. I think a little bit more they want to have like specific measurable goals, but they also want to see that it's supporting BC culture and reinvesting back into the community. So
Mhm.
it's a little bit of a mix, I think, those ones.
When it comes to one of the recurring things in the applications you've been mentioning is listing your goals and explaining your goals for the project that this money that you're applying for will help you achieve.
Mhm.
That's always kind of one of those things. It's almost like when you're doing a job interview and they're like, "How much do you want to be paid?" And you're kind of trying to do that
Yeah.
calculation of maximizing it and not pricing yourself out of a job, sort of thing. Like, how do you list your goals for what they want to hear? Like, do they want you to be ambitious? Do they want you to keep it modest and realistic? Like, how do you judge that?
Yeah, that's a thing, like, I find I always struggle with too. You don't always know how much, um, like, what they're looking for. Like, I've had some touring grants where sometimes it's like, oh, you're not making enough money, and then it's like, oh, you're making too much money on this tour. So it's like, what is it? Like, do you want to see this project successful without the grant, or do you want to show that it's, there's a need for it? But be realistic with the goals, and that's why I think having a bit of a track record is good, because as long as you can show growth, um, or maybe it's like a touring grant, maybe it's a territory that you're going back again. So going back to again, like let's say you're you're touring the UK for the second time. Talk about your first UK experience and what that did for your career and how you want to expand on it. That would be a very measurable goal, that's realistic.
In terms of, I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat that include some things that I want to ask too. So we might start the Q&A portion of this a bit earlier. But
Sure.
just in terms of what happens if and when you're successful in applying for a grant, because it's not just like, here's a bunch of money, now we never have to hear from you again. There is
Yeah.
follow-up involved in this. They want to know if that money was being spent the way it was supposed to be spent and the way you said it was going to be spent, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
So, once you've received a grant, what is the follow-up reporting like, on average when it comes to these grants? And what is required of the artists? Like, what should artists be ready to show in terms of how they use the money?
Yeah. So I think they're all pretty similar. You know, similar to the application itself. There's a budget and a written component, or not a budget, like an expense report. So most of them will ask you to provide invoices and proof of payment. So e-transfer receipts, credit card receipts, all that kind of stuff, as well as the actual invoice. So I would suggest, as soon as you pay a vendor, file that stuff away, because the final report might not be due for an entire year. So it's really easy to forget about that. And, at the end of the year, you don't want to have to track down in your email for all the invoices and stuff. So just be organized with that. Um, and the written report is pretty simple to write. They'll just ask if you were successful in your project goals, how you spent the money, how this grant helped you in your activities or development. But I do think it's important to actually like put some thought into the final report, just because all this stuff is government funded. So program coordinators, when they're asking for funding for the future years, you want to have enough evidence to show that these grants are important and they're vital to our livelihood in Canada. So, the more evidence that these program coordinators can take to the government showing that they're working, the harder it will be for them to take it away in the future.
Good point. Something I should have brought up when we were talking about kind of best practices, common tips, and that kind of stuff. What are we talking about in terms of timeline? Like, how far in advance of the deadline should you start working on an application?
Yeah, so most of them will have some window where you can apply. I know Factor, they'll have the deadline, but the application window will open up like a month in advance or something like that. So you can always apply early and check out the next deadlines too, because you might not have time to prepare an application for this one deadline, but there'll be another one coming up in a few months. So you can always just plan ahead.
Cool. Any last tips? Best tips that you want to throw in there before we get to audience questions?
Yeah, I did write down a few here. So yeah, the first is that scoring sheet. I think that's always just a great way to go about writing a grant. The second is about the vendors that you're going to hire. So like always explain why you're working with a specific vendor. Write why they are the best person for this job. So that could be maybe you've worked with them in the past and you have a great working relationship, you share common goals, or if it's a new hire, why do you want to work with them? If it's a music producer, have they recorded acts in your city, whose music is akin to yours and you want that style? So just always, and anyone you're hiring, explain why you're hiring that person. And also have some diversity amongst your team members. Not only do grant funders, like funding a variety of artists, but they also like seeing that the vendors are diverse as well. So, don't just hire like a bunch of white dudes for your project. Make sure there's some diversity on your team. Another tip is to have a strong biography. For a few reasons. I find it's typically the first thing that someone will read on a grant. That's usually like right at the top of the application. Who are you, what you've done. So work with a strong biography writer, or if you're comfortable writing a grant or bio yourself, make sure you've put a lot of thought into it. I also find it's helpful because you can pull a lot of language from the bio into the grant itself. Because chances are you've already kind of fretted over that language a lot before, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel when you're talking about your past accomplishments.
I'm just going to quickly plug something there on that topic of writing your press bio, or something would be used for the applications. If you go to nwcwebinars.com in the archives or on our YouTube section, a couple years ago, Andrew King, the previous editor-in-chief for Canadian Musician, who, like many of music journalists, also written many artist bios. He did a webinar all about writing your own press or application artist bio. So anyways, just a plug for an old webinar that's archived online on that specific element. Anyways, go ahead, man.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's nice to know that there's some like strong bio writers out there. Another tip is like, don't be afraid to reach out to the program coordinator. They're always willing and helpful in answering questions. So if you're unsure about something, shoot them an email. Try to do that early on, because the days leading up to the deadline, obviously they're like inundated with questions, but they're always willing to help. And a lot of them will have kind of grant consultants or coaches that they work with, as well as informational seminars a few weeks before the grant is due. So try to get as familiar as possible with the program, or talk to friends who have written these grants and have gotten them before. Maybe you wrote a grant for another. Maybe you wrote like a Factor grant that was successful. They wrote a Canada Council grant that was successful. Maybe trade those grants, and you can kind of see what's worked for them.
Awesome.
Mhm.
All right, we're approaching 2:40, so we're kind of on time. Only a few minutes early for this section. I knew a lot of questions were coming in. Are you ready? Do you just want to take some audience questions?
Sure. Yeah, I forgot there was one more tip
Yeah,
that I
absolutely.
just want to give, and that's what to do like after you've submitted an application.
Right.
So because the turnaround time for grants is typically like 2 to 4 months, definitely do as much as you can to boost your streaming numbers and activity on social media, because a lot of jury members will go over to the artist's social media page as they review an application. So it's always good when you can boost your performance and strengthen your presence beyond the application.
All right. Good to know. And
Mhm.
to jump into the first audience question here, Manus is passing them along to me. So again, write question in caps, put it there. It'll be easier for him to spot it and pass it on. So if you haven't put anything in there yet and have any questions, now's the time.
Mhm.
To jump into them. The first one says, are there any grants available for musicians who are not songwriters but who want to do a cover album?
Oh, interesting. Um, yes, I would think so. Because Canada Council funds like a bunch of jazz projects, and a lot of times those are or folk projects. Those are like old standards. Um, yeah, so you can pitch that on Factor as well. You always have to write out the songwriting credits for every song you're proposing with,
Hmm.
and those can be covers as well.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Do you know if it's a covers album you're putting together? Do you know if that will get less weight in the jury's opinion?
I I don't know. I guess it depends how strong the grant is.
Yeah, yeah. With
Yeah,
application and the recordings and stuff.
I would yeah, I would think maybe it's not as strong as like new material, but I don't think that's a reason to not apply. If it's a great
Hmm.
project and a great grant, it'll
Yeah.
be successful.
And again, beyond Factor, remember what was being said at the beginning, the provincial MIA administered grants and also the municipal
Yeah.
arts council grants. The lower, the smaller the area, the smaller the membership, the fewer people are applying for the grant, and the more success, the higher the chance of success.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't just focus on Factor, although that's certainly a very important one. But yeah, there might be
Yeah.
some out there at those lower levels too. Next question is actually, are there national grant opportunities for community-based music education projects? And just before, if you have anything to add to this, Andy, but just before
Mhm.
that, I do want to say, and coincidentally, I saw a press release hit my inbox just this morning from Music Counts about its Band-Aid grant projects. Music Counts it's part of the Junos and Caris. It is the big music education nonprofit in Canada, and it's specifically there to help focus provide grants and support and instruments and stuff like that for community music education organizations and projects. So the first thing I do is check out Music Counts. The other thing is reach out to your provincial music educators association to ask about this kind of stuff. I know in Ontario it's OMEA, Ontario Music Educators Association. It deals primarily with, and there's one of those really for every province. So there'll be likely an association that deals with school-based music educators, and then there'll be a separate association that's for private music educators, people with lesson studios and that kind of stuff. I would certainly
Mhm.
reach out to them with this question, and they will very likely be able to point you in the right direction. But Andy, do you have anything to add about that?
The art councils, the provincial and city art councils, I think those are probably your best bet for music education grants as well.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Also note, as we've noted, this is going to go up on YouTube, and so as we're talking quickly, and anything you want to review, this will be up on YouTube in the next couple of days for anyone that wants to review or miss something, wants to go back, write it down, or whatever.
Mhm.
All right, next question. When you're applying for grants as an emerging artist, is age taken into account for the artists, writers, producers seeking money?
Nope. No, I don't think so. Unless the grant is like specifies that it's, for like a youth oriented grant. But no, that shouldn't play a factor into it. I guess the only thing with like something like the Factor Artist Development Grant, because it's for new artists with less than 3 years of recorded experience, you'd kind of have to figure out about like your past work projects. Like, is this really a new project, or is it kind of a reiteration of an old group that's already released music in the past? But yeah, it's not like grants aren't really like ageist or anything like that.
How much do you see about um, in the applications? Is it a blind thing, or are you seeing all the information? Well, I guess you mentioned they'll go check out the social media and that, so it's not a blind application by any means, is it?
No, it isn't. They give you everything about the band and the biography. Usually you'll have to submit like your website or links and all that. Yeah.
Mhm.
So you can do a deep dive on the person's career if you want.
As a juror, how long do you typically spend on an application? This isn't audience questions, by the way. I'm just
Oh
kind of
yeah.
thinking of this as I hear you talk. But how long do you, as a juror, do you typically spend on an application?
So the juried sound recording a lot more just because it's a bigger application. It might be 20 minutes per application. I know some of the grant applications. I remember this was an issue with Music BC a few years ago. Is they told jurors to like only spend a few minutes on each application, and I just remember finding that was like so disrespectful to the artist because like it takes so long to write a grant
Mhm.
that like there's no way you can get through this in a few minutes, like to look over the budget and like a 10-page marketing plan. Um, but yeah, I don't know, like any 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour sometimes if it's like a really strong grant or there's a lot of detail. Sometimes you're just like interested in the um artist's career, so you want to read a bit more about them. Or if like one of the reasons I got on the jury was to like increase my grant writing skills as well. So sometimes you're seeing things that you're like, oh, this is like a great idea. I kind of want to like just read this over a few times because like that's a nice thing to like bank away for future grant applications.
Okay. All right. Where were we here? Next question. Do you find Factor tends to favor some vendors over others? Like vendors that have previously been part of Factor granted projects, for example?
Uh, Potentially, I think that would make sense because the team member portion of the factor grants it's quite a high score. So they probably want to see that these people have been successful or have a good track record at least. I don't know if how much they keep tabs on what vendors are on projects that have been funded, but they definitely want to see vendors that have a good track record.
No. Next audience question. What if a grant application states a grant writer cannot be written into the grant or be paid with the grant or grant
Mhm.
percentage? How would you structure a payment scale?
Well, I mean, a lot of times what I'll do, just if I am if I am taking a percentage and the grant was successful, then just put my name down as like a marketing consultant or something like that, so they can claim
Yeah.
some of that
Okay.
as well. But I think on that point too is so typically grants fund 75% of the expenses, but they do allow for something called in-kind expenses, meaning if a band member contributes to a project, that can come out of your personal investment. So if you have a band member who wants to design a website or some graphics for social media, you kind of figure out, you know, like a standard rate, and you don't actually pay them, but that money can be considered part of your 25% investment. So you don't always have to pay everything out of pocket on top of the 25% that you usually have to, pay on your own.
Okay. A very related question to that is what is the average percentage a grant writer requests if successful and average application fee? And they say, for example, newer writer, 2.5 years, high success rates, assist with grant writing along with impact reports, economic reports, after
Mhm.
final report, marketing plan and decks, bit more hands-on than just writing and editing.
Yeah. So I know for myself, I'll charge depending on the application, like anywhere between 200 and 450 or $500 for the application, and then 10% if it's successful. Some people will take 15 or 20%. But I think in that range, in that 10 to 20% range, and some kind of application fee.
Back to what you were talking about in terms of the bio being an important part of a lot of grant applications. I say,
Mhm.
are grant writers usually good at writing the bios too, or is working with a grant writer enough, or do you recommend having someone else do the bio?
I mean, I'm not a good bio writer. Sometimes you're forced into it if you have to restructure the bio. Actually, there's some grants. Um, you might take the bio and then rework some of it. Depending on the application, you might want to like drop out a lot. But I definitely recommend working with a bio writer. It would make sense if grant writers are good bio writers. I'm just not one of those people. So I usually I have someone that I like working with. He writes great bios.
All right. I'm just going to, sorry, I was just trying to find very quickly here the YouTube version of that bio writing webinar I was talking about, but I might have to find it later. All right. Where were we here? Next audience question. Are you aware of any grants that support children's music education? Again, I would, going back to what I was saying, I'd say check out Music Counts and ask folks at the Music Educators Association in your province. But sorry, Andy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that as well as the art councils.
Yeah.
They might have certain requirements for like who can apply for those. I think some of them, you might have to be an actual like registered not-for-profit. But yeah, Music Counts and the art councils.
Sounds good.
And Canada Council for the Arts also has, I think, some grants that are applicable for that as well.
Perfect. Oh, and there's also the Coalition for Music Education in Canada. It's mostly an advocacy group, but could be a good source of information on this type of stuff. Any questions specific to music education grants and resources? All right. How about grants for international partners with a Canadian emphasis?
Yep. So Canada Council for the Arts, there are applications that you can write in conjunction with someone else. Like if you have another project partner, you would list that on the application because there's an actual like area for that.
All right.
Yeah, but I would have to know, I guess, a little bit more about what project that is specifically and how that would work.
Okay, perfect. See, see another question for me about the bio writing one. So maybe as you're talking here in a sec, I'll go on our YouTube channel and try to find that old webinar I was referring to because it seems to be in demand here.
Yeah.
Anyways, all right, I'm going to pass you a question, and as you answer it, I'm going to try to find that old bio writing webinar to put in the chat here. Which grants are best suited for a brand new artist in spoken word or religious segment?
For brand new artists, are again the factor artist development. Like it isn't just for pop music. They do fund other genres, so I would recommend that one. Or again, any of the art council if it's going to be a little bit less data driven. If it's going to be less of a data driven grant, go to Canada Arts Council. Like the concept to realization grant is a pretty popular one. Okay. But you can still apply for the factor artist development grant even if it's not straightforward like rock or pop music.
Okay. Still searching for that bio writing webinar. All right. Is it possible to, another audience question, is it possible to be successful in obtaining a grant if the artist decides not to have a social media presence?
I guess so. I'd be a little weary about like writing a grant for someone who doesn't have a social media presence because you're just kind of limiting your chances. I definitely get why someone wouldn't want a social media page, but I don't know. That's a hard one. I would have to really know why. But maybe that's an interesting point to like talk about why they want to go off social media. Like maybe they're trying to like really just do it in a traditional old school way. Like that could be an interesting angle for the grant. But yeah, would want to know why they're not doing it and go from there. Could be an interesting play.
Just looking for next one.
Mhm.
Oh, man, a lot of questions about the artist bio. How long are these artist bios? Does it need to be thorough and detailed, or more of a brief overview that gets the point across quickly? I'm going to say typically, I know for press artist bios, really you're just looking for about 400 to 500 words, which is really only a few paragraphs. And you're generally kind of just trying to highlight in a press bio um, the style of the artist, what's the latest project, what are previous albums, and certainly highlight any awards, positive reviews, accolades or sign-offs from better known artists. And if you've worked with a better known artist or a known producer who's worked with big artists, kind of highlight that stuff. It's really just trying to hit those key points that are going to grab someone's attention and give them just a quick snapshot of who you are and why they should pay attention. But Andy, sorry,
Oh
what do you
yeah,
want to
no,
add
no.
about the bio thing?
I think those are all valid points. For like mostly when someone writes a bio for you, they'll probably give a couple of versions, or maybe charge an additional fee to do a shortened version of it as well. It's definitely good to work off the long form version of the bio, which is 400 words. But if the bio is in like a marketing plan where there's a certain page limit that you can't exceed, maybe use the short version, which might be 100 to 200 words kind of thing.
All
But
right.
on Factor for the artist development grant, you just upload the bio as like a PDF. It's not in the written application, so go for the long form, because then you can just talk about yourself a little bit more, especially if you have some key producers, name drop who they've worked with.
Perfect. I finally found the YouTube link to that old Canadian
Sweet.
Musician NWC webinar that's all about bio writing. I wasn't expecting so many questions about the bio component of these applications,
Yeah.
but one of our old webinars is all about bio writing. So in the chat, I've just posted the link to the archived YouTube video of that old webinar all about bio writing. And hopefully that answers all your questions there. All right. Any last questions here before we get going? How do we contact you with help about or advice about grant writing and submissions? And I'm going to add to that, just in general, how should people find a suitable grant writer?
I guess I'll post my email just in the chat here for anyone who wants. But if you want to find other grant writers, just Google Grant Writing Canada or Grant Writers Canada. I'm assuming that's how most people find me that I don't know from other provinces.
Is Grant Writers?
Yeah,
I didn't even know
just
about that.
Google
Is Grant Writers Canada like an association or a collective of?
Not that.
Oh,
I
you
know
mean
of.
just Google the phrase?
Oh, just like Google it. Yeah, if
Yeah,
you're looking
I thought you were
grant
referring to
writers.
Grant Writers Canada as some sort of association.
No, I don't think there's some kind of guild or anything like that.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right,
yeah.
just Google the phrase. All right.
Yeah.
I kind of I know there's a lot of these kinds of grant writing panels, whether you're looking at Canadian Music Week, Indie Week, Breakout West, all the industry conferences that go on in Canada. Often there's at least one grant writing panel on those. So even if you kind of Google the conference plus grant writing, you might find an old panel that's going to include grant writers too. Just another tip on how to find other grant writers online, I would suggest.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and talk to your music industry association too, because
Yes.
if you're looking to get a grant for like an MIA specific grant, they'll have grant coaches that they work with, and I think actually Creative BC has on their website BC grant writers, some like common ones. So talk to your MIA too.
Okay. And of course, the best way to find anybody for anything is always references. So if you're all, presumably most of you are artists out there and you know other artists. So if you know someone who has, received a Factor grant or another grant of some kind, ask them who did it for them, or if they did it themselves, certainly reach out to them for advice and that kind of stuff. All right. I'm just trying to do a quick scroll here, see if there's any questions that we've missed. Few thank yous. Sorry, Andy put his email there. Andy Schichter, just Andy Schichter at gmail.com. Dinah says, nice to meet you both. Thank you for your time and all the knowledge shared. It's much appreciated. You're very, very welcome. Okay, one last question here from Delaney. How do you keep your writing skills sharp or up to date? Example, over time, becoming lazy / forgetting grammar rules, etc. Any workshops, seminars, or continuing study programs to keep your writing skills improving and growing?
I don't know. I think just constantly writing grants, like it's a part-time thing for me, because I'm mostly in the studio, but there's definitely times, when there's a grant deadline coming up, you'll get like a bunch of work at once, and then it might be a slow month with grant writing, and then a deadline will come up and it increases again. So I think just writing for a variety of artists too. I think that's one way to stay sharp. Like in the past few months, I've written grants for genres that I don't necessarily listen to or aren't familiar with. So I think that's a nice way to stay sharp, is actually just don't always write grants for like rock or folk. Kind of just broaden your horizons a little bit. But in terms of like grammar and stuff, I mean, I always get my wife to proofread my grants in case I miss anything. And I don't know, use something like Grammarly.
Yeah. I as obviously editor and writer professionally myself, I know, going back to what you're saying about don't be doing this at the last minute. As a juror, you can always tell when this was done rushed at the last minute. I know even as a professional writer, it's almost impossible to edit something effectively that you just finished editing. Because often what happens is it's so fresh in your mind that you're really reading what's in your mind, what you know it's supposed to say, rather than what's actually written in front of you. And so you miss a lot of, there may be a word missing and you don't even almost process it because you're kind of just reading what you know it's supposed to say. So I know in editing something I wrote personally, I have to leave at least a day, preferably more, between when I wrote it and when I go back to edit it, so that I'm actually reading and processing it with my eyes rather than just reading what I know in my head it's supposed to say.
Yeah, I think that's just good advice, like in general, like when you're writing or creating music. Like I know when I'm mixing, for example, you just come to a point where you're not even like trusting your decisions anymore, or you get like ear fatigue. Then you just walk away, come back fresh the next day, and you'll just be so much more effective once you've actually had some time away from it. Let your brain reset it.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
that's the other. Yeah. So if you start writing a grant early, you'll have enough buffer time to kind of recharge and reset.
Absolutely. David here asked for the jury selected recordings one. Is it okay to really submit tracks shortly after the application deadline?
Yep. Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Yeah. You can claim back those costs as long as you have submitted the application. You're good to release the music.
All right. Perfect. We're now 3:00 now, 3:01. We're going to close it off there. This flew by. Andy, we've covered a lot. Just thank you, first of all, for making the time for this. And you've shared a lot of great information. So yeah, some big thanks from all of us for doing this. I see a couple questions there about whether people can rewatch this. Yes. If you're here, obviously you register with an email. We're going to be sending a follow-up email, and that will be some resources, but also included in that follow-up email coming in the next few days will be the archive video of this session. You can also go to NWC webinars. It will be archived there, nwcwebinars.com. It'll be archived there. And you can also, of course, watch the videos of all our past webinars, and also on the NWC YouTube channel. It'll be there. And so, yeah, there's plenty of opportunities to rewatch this. I know we've covered a lot, sometimes speak quickly and stuff kind of flies by. So highly suggest going and rewatching and finding whatever things that you heard and want to verify or jot down. But all right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. It's lovely to see so many people here, and hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was useful. And Andy, thanks again for your time, man.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you.